Hello, 10-minute book talk people. We are so happy you're here. I'm Katherine Reay, and I'm here with dear friends and co-hosts Rachel Linden and Marie Bostwick. Today, we have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Carolyn Curry about her new book, Sudden Death. And I would love it. Well, I'm going to tell you, first of all, Carolyn and I met last spring when I gave a book talk on the London House. And I am so delighted that she can be here to talk with you about her novel. So, Carolyn, will you please tell us about Sudden Death?
This is a murder mystery set in the world of football, and everybody is amazed and asking, how in the world did you write a murder mystery? Well, it's amazing to me and surprising to me too, because I've spent my entire life in the world of footnotes and bibliographies and very precise language. But it's been a great adventure that I started while sitting on the beach in Hawaii with a yellow legal pad 20 years ago. And you know, when you're relaxed and you're letting your imagination take off and you're writing in longhand, and it was just this idea that came to me, which we will discuss in some of your questions later, I'm sure. But the premise was, what if a coach were actually killed, shot on the sidelines? And this sounds like such a preposterous idea, but we had received death threats. And what if somebody really tried to follow through on it? And I don't know if you noticed this weekend, but in the state of Texas, a youth league football coach was shot on the football field by another coach. So the emotions that go into football, especially in the South where it's a religion, it's almost a religion in every state now. There's so much excitement and fun that goes with it, but there's also a dark side of the stress and the anxiety that families go through. And so I use the guise of a murder mystery, and it really is a whodunit with several suspects and all of that. But at the same time, I'm uncovering some of the problems and the darker issues that exist. Gambling in sports, addiction to alcohol, addiction to the game itself, addiction to gambling, and all of these undercurrents that cause problems. So I do get into some serious issues, but I have some fun at the same time. And I've been getting a good response from people about the book. So I'm excited about that.
Good. You alluded to it briefly, but I'm going to sort of zone in on it a little more. You are married to one of the nation's most famous college football coaches. And so your personal experience does play into it. So how did you sort of, maybe separate personal to fiction, but also how did it influence your story?
That's a very good question. My husband played college football at Georgia Tech, played in the National Football League for 10 years. We went to 3 Super Bowls and had all that fun. And then he was a college coach for 27 years at 4 different universities. And what I did was I created a fictional school with fictional characters, because I didn't want to say, oh, you're talking about that university, or you're talking about that university. But at the same time, I talked about incidents that had happened to us and to me. And I received a death threat, and people are always astounded when they hear that I received a death threat. And so I worked all of that into the plot of my story, and it just came out, it just flowed, and it was easy. And it actually ended up being cathartic for me. I think I got a lot of this anxiety and these things that I had carried for years, because when I got my death threat, the FBI said, oh, this is just a hoax. They don't usually follow through. But I'm teaching at the university and they tell me to leave town. And I have an armed guard in my class when I come back. And this is just a hoax. It's probably not going to happen, but we're going to take it very seriously. But we'd had a player murdered and they had not solved that problem yet. So people don't think about all these horrible things that go on in the background of college football, and you keep it quiet because you don't want it out there. You want people thinking about your games and the fun and all of that. But there are a lot of, we used to call it a crisis a day, and some of them are really big and some of them are smaller. But there are a lot of, when you have 100 children and a world out there that's emotionally involved in what you do, a lot goes on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I feel like my life is totally boring now.
Thankfully so.
Yeah, in some degree, thankfully so. But I mean, like, wow, the things you've experienced and done. Carolyn, I haven't had the opportunity to read your book, but I, as a novelist myself, now you alluded to, you've spent a lot of your life in the area of bibliography and footnotes, right? So you are a doctor, you have a PhD, and you've written nonfiction in the past. Your book was called, remind me again?
Oh, Suffer and Grow Strong.
Suffer and Go Strong. So talk to me about how was it different than this scholarly and nonfiction writing you did to come to, what was the process? How was it different to write a novel and deal in the world of fiction?
Okay, Suffer and Grow Strong was a biography of a Civil War woman who kept a diary for 41 years. Her family lost everything during the Civil War. She had 4 children die. She had to recover from that horrific loss. And at the end of her life, she ended up president of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association when that was very controversial in 1899. So I've always concentrated on women's lives and how they recover. And this story is basically a story of recovery, how you come back from these horrific events. But I had to learn to use my fiction brain because I had a nonfiction brain. And the first draft of my book that I sent to my publisher, he said, you got a story here, but you've written it like a historian. He said, I want you to find your fiction brain. And so I had an editor that would read it and say, tell me more about how they were feeling and paint me a picture. And it's something all of you know how to do. Show me, don't tell me. A historian tends to tell you, but a novelist shows you. And I had to learn to do that. But at the same time, this was during COVID and you're all sort of locked down, and it was fun. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Had great readers and editors that just would sort of spur me on, give me an idea and I would run with it. But it is very different. And my publisher said that some people cannot switch from nonfiction to fiction and vice versa, because you do have to have a completely different approach to your writing. But the fact that I enjoyed it so much, I may try it again.
Good for you. Good for you.
Now, Carolyn, I have not read your book either, but I've heard that, and you mentioned this as well, that it does touch on some pretty heavy themes. And I'm curious, what are you hoping that readers will walk away with when they close the cover of the book?
Okay. An important subplot of my book is spouse abuse. When I was at the University of Kentucky, I was teaching in the university. My husband was a football coach, and the local newspaper was running a series on spouse abuse. They actually won a Pulitzer for it. And they asked me to do a public service announcement. So I did, and we ran a telephone number at the bottom of the screen telling how women could call in if they were having problems. And when I received my death threats, the FBI believed that it was because I had made that public service announcement, and they believed that the man who made the threat was an abuser and a gambler in sports. So these are 2 topics that I concentrate on. Billions of dollars are gambled in sports every year. People don't realize that. And gambling is an addiction, just like alcohol is an addiction. And a man might gamble his whole salary on a football game on a weekend, as astounding as that might sound. But that's a real problem. And we're concerned that now gambling has come into the mainstream. It's being advertised on television, NFL games, Caesars gambling something. And then spouse abuse, which is an important subplot I talk about, is an epidemic, was at that time, and it is today, and it became even worse during COVID. So I hope that we will talk more about spouse abuse, and there's not that much discussion of spouse abuse in literature. I have been told a lot of people don't write about spouse abuse. It's sort of we just don't talk about it enough, and it's such a problem. And I've done my book debuted a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still on the debut tour. But there's been a lot of discussion about spouse abuse. And a woman from a very affluent family came up to me this week and said, I was abused. And, there's just this talking about it. I was abused. I went to recovery, and all of that is a positive thing. So I have been very pleased with the discussions we've had already, and I think which we will all be having when we discuss this book. Guns, the proliferation of guns in our culture in the hands of young, mentally disturbed young men is another important part of the book. So one person who wrote me an email said, I've just read your book and I think you hit on just about every social issue we have. So I hope so. I've talked about a lot, and I hope that it will help us to discuss these things seriously.
Yeah, right. You definitely cover a lot of serious issues wrapped in a riveting fictional story. But we have one last question that we always ask before we let you go. What is making you happy today? What's bringing you joy?
Well, I'll say two things. I'm sitting here, this scene that's behind me is right out that window. And it's
wow.
a beautiful day in North Carolina, and sunflowers and dahlias are blooming and hydrangeas everywhere. It's really gorgeous. And we had a lovely party with about 60 or 70 of our closest friends from Georgia Tech and Atlanta. So we had a wonderful time yesterday. So I'm in a beautiful place. It's very restful. And I have the rest of the day off, and I have tomorrow off, and I don't do another event until Saturday. So I'm very grateful for that. And I will say one other thing. I'm reading Geraldine Brooks' Horse. I love it.
Yeah.
And,
My computer's sitting on it, or here, I'll see if I can grab it and I'll show you all. My sister.
I read all of her books, and we lived in Lexington for 7 years. And, you know, the horse, the stallion, and all that stuff. So I always have to mention a really good book as a pleasure.
I have heard it's brilliant. So Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. And 10-Minute Book Talk World, we will be back with you next week. We were discussing sudden death today, and we will discuss another book next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
you.
I enjoyed